Poor trash workers should eat in the kitchen, not at tables like this, my sister Vanessa said loud enough for half the restaurant to hear, and the strange thing was, nobody at the table looked shocked when she said it. They just looked down at their wine glasses like this was normal now. I kept my eyes on my plate and slowly cut into my filet mignon even though my fingers had suddenly gone cold. The chandelier lights above us reflected softly against the crystal glasses, and somewhere near the grand piano at the center of the ballroom, people were laughing over cocktails as if my humiliation were just another part of the evening's entertainment. I'm Helen Carter, 67 years old, and that night at the Whitmore Foundation charity dinner, my own sister tried to erase 40 years of hard work with a single sentence. The Crescent Room at the Grand Belle Hotel smelled faintly of expensive perfume, buttered lobster, and polished wood. Every table was dressed in white linen with tall candles flickering in glass cylinders. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered under the October rain. Vanessa loved places like this because they made her feel important. She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and smiled at the women seated beside her. Helen still works around cleaning crews, she said casually, swirling her wine. Some people just never move up in life. A few uncomfortable chuckles circled the table. Her husband Richard cleared his throat but said nothing. My nephew Tyler suddenly became very interested in checking his phone. Nobody defended me. Nobody ever did when Vanessa started performing for wealthy strangers. I dabbed my mouth gently with my napkin and forced myself to breathe normally. The truth was, I had spent most of my life cleaning buildings. I had cleaned office towers at midnight, hotels during Christmas weekends, and medical clinics before sunrise. I knew the smell of industrial bleach better than perfume. I knew what exhaustion felt like when your back hurt so badly you sat in your car for 10 minutes before driving home. But what Vanessa never understood was that there is dignity in work. Real dignity. Not the kind purchased with designer handbags and country club memberships. She leaned closer to the guests beside her and lowered her voice just enough to make sure I could still hear every word. Last month she called me asking about arthritis cream, Vanessa whispered with a smirk. That's usually how life goes when you spend decades pushing a mop. More laughter followed. Soft. Polite. Cruel. I took a sip of ice water because it was safer than speaking. Across the ballroom, waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne flutes while a jazz trio played near the marble staircase. I could feel heat rising into my cheeks, but I refused to give Vanessa what she wanted. She had always confused silence with weakness. The waiter beside our table suddenly straightened his posture. Several people near the entrance turned their heads at once. A tall silver-haired man in a dark navy suit had just entered the ballroom surrounded by hotel executives and foundation donors. Charles Whitmore. Even from across the room, people reacted when he walked in. Vanessa immediately brightened and touched her hair. That's Charles Whitmore, she whispered excitedly to the table. His real estate company owns half the commercial properties in Illinois. Then she laughed softly and glanced at me again. Don't worry, Helen. People like him don't notice cleaning ladies. I lowered my fork carefully onto the edge of my plate. Because at that exact moment, Charles Whitmore stopped walking, looked directly across the ballroom at me, and his entire expression changed. Charles Whitmore stood near the entrance for several long seconds without speaking, and I could feel the energy in the ballroom shift before anyone even understood why. Conversation softened. Waiters slowed their steps. Vanessa straightened in her chair so quickly that the diamonds around her neck caught the candlelight like tiny flashes of ice. Oh my goodness, she whispered under her breath. Maybe he is coming over here. Richard immediately adjusted his suit jacket while Tyler finally looked up from his phone for the first time all evening. I stayed still. My hands rested quietly beside my plate, though my heartbeat had begun moving heavily against my ribs. Charles started walking across the ballroom. Not toward the center stage where the foundation board members waited. Not toward the mayor near the bar. Toward our table. The closer he came, the more nervous Vanessa became. Her smile sharpened into something almost desperate. Richard, she whispered quickly, make sure you introduce me properly. Mention the Naples property. Richard nodded once, already preparing his business smile. I almost pitied them. Almost. Charles stopped beside my chair and looked directly at me with warm disbelief in his grey eyes. Helen Carter, he said softly. I knew that was you. The entire table went silent. Vanessa blinked twice before forcing a laugh. Oh, you two know each other, she asked too brightly. Charles never looked at her. Know each other, he repeated with a small smile. Mrs. Carter saved my company 15 years ago. I slowly placed my napkin on the table. Around us, nearby conversations faded into silence as people began listening openly now. Vanessa's expression tightened. I think there must be some confusion, she said carefully. My sister works in commercial cleaning. Charles finally turned toward her then, though his expression remained polite. Yes, he replied calmly. She does. Vanessa relaxed too quickly. I could almost see the relief pass across her face. Then Charles added, she also owns Carter Commercial Services. The silence that followed felt enormous. I watched Tyler's mouth slowly fall open. Richard stared at me as if he had suddenly realized he had been sitting beside a stranger all evening. Vanessa laughed again, but this time the sound cracked in the middle. Owns, she repeated weakly. Charles nodded once. One of the largest privately owned commercial cleaning companies in the Midwest. My firm contracts with her across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. I looked down at the untouched asparagus on my plate because suddenly everyone at the table was staring at me. Funny how quickly people learn respect once money enters the room. Charles pulled out the chair beside mine and sat down naturally, as though this were the most obvious place for him to be. Helen, he said warmly, I have been trying to reach you for weeks. Your assistant said you were avoiding public events lately. I have been busy, I answered quietly. My voice sounded calm even to me. Vanessa looked physically uncomfortable now, shifting in her seat while smoothing invisible wrinkles from the tablecloth. Well, she said quickly, Helen has always been very humble about her little business. Little business. I almost smiled at the phrase. 42 years ago my little business had started with a used cargo van that barely survived Chicago winters. I used to drive through snowstorms before dawn carrying mops and industrial supplies in the back while listening to old country music on a broken radio. Some mornings I cleaned office bathrooms alone before wealthy executives arrived carrying briefcases that cost more than my monthly rent. Back then Vanessa refused to tell her friends what I did for a living. Tell people you work in maintenance, she used to whisper. Cleaning sounds depressing. Charles leaned back slightly in his chair. Your sister built an extraordinary company, he said firmly. Most people in this city have walked through buildings her teams maintain every single day. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward her wine glass. For the first time all evening, she had nothing to say. The rest of dinner continued with the strange tension that settles over a room after people realize they may have judged someone too quickly. The jazz trio still played near the marble staircase, waiters still carried silver trays through the ballroom, and candlelight still flickered softly across polished glasses, but our table no longer felt comfortable. Vanessa barely touched her food after that. Every few minutes, I noticed her glancing at me as if trying to understand when the balance between us had shifted. The truth was, it had shifted years ago. She had just been too busy admiring herself to notice. Charles asked me questions about the company while the others sat quietly listening. Are you still expanding into Milwaukee? He asked. We are finishing negotiations on 3 new properties, I answered calmly. Hospitals this time. He smiled with genuine respect. I knew you would keep growing. I thanked him softly and reached for my water glass. Across the table, Tyler looked completely stunned. Wait, he said carefully, you own all those cleaning trucks with the blue logo. I nodded once. Some of them. He blinked several times. I see those everywhere downtown. Vanessa immediately interrupted with a brittle laugh. Helen has always been private about money. Private? That was one way to describe decades of hiding parts of myself just to make other people comfortable. But the truth sat heavier than that. I remembered family parties where Vanessa introduced me as if I were an embarrassment she needed to manage carefully. "My sister works with cleaning crews," she would say vaguely before quickly changing the subject. At her country club Christmas dinner 5 years earlier, she seated me near the kitchen entrance beside distant relatives while her wealthy friends occupied the main table near the fireplace. I still remembered the hostess asking if I was part of the catering staff because Vanessa had told everyone I helped maintain commercial properties. Even then, I said nothing. I simply smiled and ate my dinner while listening to strangers discuss stock portfolios and vacation homes as though those things measured human worth. Charles leaned closer toward me now. "Your company handled the restoration after the Lake County flood, did it not?" "Yes," I answered. 300 displaced tenants. We worked around the clock for almost 2 weeks. He shook his head slightly in admiration. Most firms would have charged triple during an emergency like that. I looked down at the candle beside my plate. People needed help. Silence settled briefly after that. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. The kind that forces people to confront things they would rather ignore. Vanessa suddenly adjusted her necklace again and forced another smile. "Helen always had a strong work ethic," she said quickly. "Even as children she was stubbornly hardworking." I almost laughed at the revision of history. When we were girls growing up in Rockford, Illinois, our father lost his factory job during a brutal winter. I was 16 when I started cleaning motel rooms after school to help cover groceries and heating bills. Vanessa was 13 then. She hated when classmates found out where I worked. One afternoon she passed me in the motel parking lot while I carried garbage bags toward the dumpster. She pretended not to know me. I still remember that feeling more clearly than I remember most birthdays. Not anger. Not sadness. Just cold understanding. Some people love you only when your existence does not embarrass them. Richard finally cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, Helen," he said carefully, "you certainly kept all this quiet." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Nobody ever asked. The words landed softly at the table, but I could see the discomfort spreading across their faces afterward. Because deep down, they all knew that was true. Dessert arrived shortly after that, though almost nobody seemed interested in eating anymore. The waiters placed slices of flourless chocolate cake and small dishes of raspberry cream in front of us while the ballroom buzzed softly with distant conversation. I noticed people occasionally glancing toward our table now. Word traveled quickly in rooms filled with wealthy donors and business executives. Especially when pride had just collapsed in public. Vanessa kept stirring her coffee even after the sugar had dissolved completely. The spoon clinked nervously against the porcelain cup every few seconds. Tiny sharp sounds. Like cracks spreading through glass. Charles remained relaxed beside me, speaking warmly about business contracts and community projects while my family listened in stunned silence. Helen was the only contractor willing to keep staff employed during the recession, he said at one point. Most companies cut people loose immediately. I shrugged lightly. People still had mortgages. Children. Medical bills. Charles smiled faintly. Exactly why your employees would walk through fire for you. Vanessa finally looked up then. Employees, she repeated carefully. How many people work for your company now? I took a small sip of coffee before answering. Around 1,400 during peak seasons. Her expression froze completely. 1,400. I could almost hear her recalculating every insult she had thrown at me over the years. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair as though seeing me clearly for the first time. Tyler stared openly now, no longer pretending otherwise. That is bigger than Dad's company, he muttered under his breath. Nobody corrected him. I watched Vanessa carefully because people reveal their true nature most honestly when embarrassment replaces confidence. A few hours earlier she had laughed about the smell of bleach on my clothes. Now her eyes carried something different. Fear. Not fear for me. Fear for herself. Fear that she had humiliated the wrong person in front of the wrong audience. The strange thing was, I did not feel victorious. Just tired. Deeply tired in the way only family disappointment can exhaust you. Charles turned toward me again. Are you attending the board dinner next month? He asked. Everyone keeps asking if you finally agreed to join. Vanessa nearly dropped her spoon. Board dinner, she repeated softly. Charles nodded casually. The Illinois Commercial Leadership Board. We have been trying to recruit Helen for years. I looked down at my hands for a moment. The skin across my knuckles had grown thinner with age, marked by faint lines and pale scars from decades of physical work. Hands Vanessa used to mock openly. Those are janitor hands, she once laughed during a family barbecue after I helped carry trays inside. I remembered standing at her kitchen sink washing sauce from my fingers while her wealthy friends pretended not to stare. That was 12 years ago. She had introduced me that afternoon as my hard-working sister who still does cleaning jobs. Still. As if labor were something shameful people should eventually escape from to become worthy of respect. Charles stood as someone across the ballroom called his name. Before leaving, he rested a hand gently against my shoulder. Do not disappear before I speak with you privately tonight, he said. There is something important we should discuss. Of course, I answered quietly. He smiled once more at me before walking away through the ballroom. Crowd. The moment he disappeared, the silence at our table became unbearable. Vanessa finally forced a smile toward me, though it looked fragile now. Helen, she said softly, you should have told us about all this. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. Candlelight flickered across the wine glasses between us. Somewhere near the stage, someone laughed too loudly. Would it have changed the way you treated me? I asked gently. Vanessa opened her mouth immediately. Then stopped. Because for once in her life, she did not know how to lie fast enough. Vanessa never answered my question. She lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth and adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist again, but the silence between us said more than any apology could have. Around us, dinner guests continued moving through the ballroom beneath warm golden lights while soft jazz drifted through the air, but our table felt strangely isolated now. Like a stage after the performance has ended and everyone suddenly sees the props for what they really are. Richard cleared his throat and attempted a nervous smile. I think there has been a misunderstanding tonight, he said carefully. Vanessa did not mean anything personally. I looked at him calmly. She called me trash. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again because there was nothing to argue with. Those had been her exact words. Tyler shifted uncomfortably beside his father. Aunt Helen, he said quietly, why did you never tell us about the company? His voice sounded different now. Softer. Almost embarrassed. I folded my hands together in my lap before answering. Because every time I tried to talk about work, someone changed the subject. Tyler stared down at his plate after that. And the painful thing was, I do not think he remembered doing it. That is how family disrespect often works. Not through dramatic cruelty every day, but through thousands of tiny dismissals repeated so often they begin to feel normal. Vanessa used to interrupt me constantly at gatherings. If I mentioned business struggles, she would suddenly talk about vacations. If I shared a success story, she would laugh and ask whether I still clean toilets myself. Everyone always smiled politely afterward and moved on. Nobody defended me because nobody wanted discomfort at the dinner table. I learned a long time ago that people will tolerate quiet humiliation as long as it keeps the evening pleasant. A waiter approached carrying fresh coffee and quietly refilled our cups. The smell of roasted espresso drifted warmly between us. I noticed Vanessa's hands trembling slightly now when she reached for her spoon. She finally looked at me again. Helen, she said softly, I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot tonight. Wrong foot. I almost admired the elegance of that phrase. As though years of insults could be reduced to a social misunderstanding. I glanced across the ballroom toward the enormous windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Rain slid slowly down the glass outside, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and white. For a moment, I remembered another rainy evening nearly 20 years earlier. My company was still small then. Just for employees and a rented office space above a hardware store. Vanessa had invited me to a charity auction at her country club because she needed an extra guest at her table. Halfway through dinner, one of her friends asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed lightly and said, "Helen spends her life cleaning up after other people." Everyone chuckled politely while I sat there holding my wine glass so tightly my fingers hurt. On the drive home that night, I cried at a red light for exactly 30 seconds. Then I wiped my face and kept driving because I had payroll due Friday morning and 3 employees depending on me. That was the difference between us. Vanessa cared about appearances. I cared about survival. Tyler suddenly spoke again, almost cautiously now. "Mom," he said to Vanessa, "that thing you said earlier was pretty harsh." Vanessa's face tightened immediately. "Do not start," she snapped quietly. "I was joking." "No," I said softly before Tyler could answer. The table turned toward me again. "You were not joking." My voice remained calm, but I could feel the weight of 40 years sitting quietly behind every word. "Jokes are supposed to make people laugh together. You wanted everyone laughing at me." Vanessa stared at me across the candlelight, and for the first time in my life, I watched my sister run out of confidence. The ballroom had grown louder again by then, but our table remained trapped inside a different kind of silence. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that settles over people after truth strips away years of pretending. Vanessa sat perfectly still now, her posture rigid beneath the soft chandelier light. I noticed she no longer looked around the room searching for attention. That part of her had disappeared the moment Charles Whitmore publicly spoke my name with respect. Funny how quickly confidence fades when status changes direction. Richard suddenly reached for his wine glass and drank nearly half of it at once. Tyler stared down at the white linen tablecloth while absent-mindedly folding the corner of his napkin between his fingers. Nobody seemed to know what version of me they were supposed to speak to anymore. The embarrassing older sister. The cleaning woman. Or the business owner they had accidentally humiliated in front of one of the most powerful men in Illinois real estate. I honestly did not know which part hurt more. The insults themselves or the realization that respect had finally appeared only after money entered the conversation. Vanessa finally exhaled slowly and looked at me again. "I think you are taking this too personally," she said softly. "Even now. Even after everything." I almost smiled at the predictability of it. Some people would rather rewrite reality than admit cruelty. "Am I?" I asked gently. My voice remained calm, but I could feel years rising quietly inside me now like water behind a dam. "Do you remember Easter at your house 6 years ago?" Vanessa blinked once, clearly caught off guard. "What does that have to do with tonight?" "You introduced me to your neighbors as the woman who cleaned office bathrooms for a living." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Tyler slowly looked up. Vanessa laughed nervously. "Oh please, Helen. You are twisting things." But I was not twisting anything. I remembered every detail with painful clarity. The smell of grilled salmon on the patio. The pale pink roses near the fence line. The way Vanessa smiled politely while saying, "My sister works in janitorial services." Janitorial services. Like my entire life could be compressed into something people politely ignored between appetizers and dessert. "You spent years acting embarrassed by me," I said quietly. "Not because I worked hard. Because my work reminded you where we came from." Vanessa's expression hardened slightly then. Not guilt. Defensiveness. "We all worked hard growing up," she snapped. "You are not the only person who struggled." "No," I agreed softly. "But I was the only one scrubbing motel bathrooms at 4 in the morning while still finishing high school." Silence again. Heavy this time. I remembered those mornings clearly. Winter darkness outside. Cheap coffee burning my tongue during bus rides across Rockford. My hands cracked from industrial chemicals before I turned 18. After our father lost his job, somebody had to help keep the lights on. Our mother cried quietly over unpaid bills while Vanessa worried whether classmates would discover we were poor. I worried whether we would lose the house. Tyler suddenly spoke in a low voice. "Mom," he said carefully, "is that true?" Vanessa immediately looked offended. Of course it is not that simple. But it was that simple. It always had been. People like Vanessa survive by polishing the story until they no longer recognize the truth underneath it. I glanced around the ballroom once more. Couples laughed beside the dance floor. Champagne glasses shimmered beneath golden light. Somewhere near the stage, an elderly man adjusted his bow tie while smiling at his wife. The evening still looked elegant from the outside. But inside me, something old had finally stopped pretending. "The sad part is," I said quietly, looking directly at my sister now, "I never needed you to admire me. I just wanted you to stop being ashamed of me." Vanessa opened her mouth again, but no words came out this time. Because deep down, she knew exactly what I was saying was true. Vanessa looked away from me after that. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just quietly, like someone suddenly exhausted from holding up a version of herself that no longer worked. The candles between us had burned lower now, small rivers of melted wax gathering at the base of the glass holders. Around the ballroom, the charity dinner was beginning to soften into late evening conversation and music. People drifted toward the dance floor carrying champagne glasses while servers cleared away dessert plates. But our table remained frozen in the aftermath of something much heavier than embarrassment. I sat there listening to the distant piano and realized I no longer felt angry. That surprised me more than anything. For years I had imagined what it might feel like to finally confront Vanessa. I thought there would be satisfaction in it. Some sharp emotional release after decades of swallowing insults with polite smiles. Instead, I only felt sadness. The slow kind. The kind that arrives when you finally understand somebody will never love you correctly. Richard stood first. "I am going to get another drink," he muttered awkwardly before walking away without waiting for a response. Tyler followed a moment later after mumbling something about finding friends near the ballroom entrance. That left only Vanessa and me sitting beneath the warm gold light at our table. Sisters. Separated by pride more than years. Vanessa kept staring down into her untouched coffee. "You always make me sound cruel," she said quietly after several long moments. Her voice no longer carried confidence now. Just fatigue. I folded my hands carefully in my lap. "No," I answered softly. "I just stopped protecting you from the truth." That seemed to hurt her more than anger would have. She looked up at me slowly then, and for the first time all evening, I saw something honest pass across her face. Not superiority. Not defensiveness. Shame. "You do not understand what it was like for me growing up," she whispered. "I hated feeling poor all the time." I nodded gently because that part was true. We both grew up inside the same tiny house with stained carpet and overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter. We both watched our mother cut coupons under dim yellow light while pretending everything would be fine. But struggle changes people differently. Some become compassionate. Others spend their entire lives running from the memory of being powerless. Vanessa became the second kind. I was embarrassed too, I admitted quietly. The difference is I was never embarrassed by you. Her eyes filled slightly then, though she quickly looked away before tears could fully form. That was another thing about Vanessa. She believed emotion itself was weakness. Even now, at 63 years old, she still wore control like expensive jewelry. I glanced toward the ballroom entrance where Charles Whitmore was speaking with several executives near the coat check area. Every few moments, he glanced back toward our table as if making sure I had not disappeared yet. Vanessa noticed too. "You really know people like him," she murmured softly. I almost smiled at the phrasing. People like him. Wealthy people. Powerful people. Important people. As though human value were still divided into categories she desperately wanted access to. He knows me because I kept my promises, I said simply. That is all. Vanessa slowly shook her head. No, she whispered. It is more than that. Maybe it was. But not in the way she thought. Success had never changed who I was. It only revealed who everyone else had been all along. I remembered the employees who stayed with me for decades. The janitors who brought homemade casseroles when my husband died. The night supervisors who called me personally during snowstorms to make sure I got home safely. Respect built slowly through kindness lasts longer than admiration built on money. A soft announcement echoed through the ballroom speakers then, thanking guests for attending the foundation fundraiser. People began collecting coats and saying goodbyes beneath the chandeliers. I reached for my purse quietly and stood from the table. Vanessa looked up at me immediately, almost startled by the movement. For one strange second, she looked less like my elegant younger sister and more like the frightened 13-year-old girl from Rockford who once cried because classmates mocked her thrift store shoes. Helen, she said softly as I adjusted my coat. Over my shoulders. I never meant for things to become this bad between us. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. That is the problem, Vanessa, I said gently. You never noticed when they were becoming bad at all. The rain had slowed to a soft mist by the time I walked toward the ballroom exit. Hotel staff moved quietly through the lobby collecting abandoned champagne glasses while guests disappeared into black town cars waiting beneath the glowing awning outside. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as I adjusted my coat tighter around my shoulders. Behind me, I could still feel the weight of the evening lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. Some nights change relationships forever without anyone raising their voice. This was one of those nights. Helen. I turned and saw Charles Whitmore approaching from near the elevators, his suit jacket folded neatly over one arm. He smiled warmly when he reached me. I was afraid you would leave before I could speak with you properly. I considered it, I admitted softly. He glanced briefly back toward the ballroom doors before lowering his voice slightly. For what it is worth, you handled yourself with extraordinary grace tonight. I gave a small smile, though it felt tired. Grace usually just means a woman learned how to survive humiliation quietly. Charles studied me carefully after that, as though understanding more than I intended to reveal. Still, he said gently, most people would not have remained calm. I looked toward the rain-covered windows facing downtown Chicago. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement outside in long silver streaks. Anger would not have changed who they are, I answered. It only would have changed who I am. For a moment neither of us spoke. Somewhere behind the front desk, luggage wheels rolled softly across polished tile while a pianist near the hotel lounge played slow jazz for the last remaining guests. The city felt quieter after midnight. More honest somehow. Charles eventually handed me a small cream-colored envelope embossed with the Whitmore Properties logo. I meant what I said earlier, he told me. The board wants you involved. Officially now. Not just because of your company. Because of the way people trust you. I accepted the envelope carefully. Thank you. You earned it, he replied simply. Not inherited it. Not married into it. Earned it. Those words settled somewhere deep inside me because they carried a kind of respect no amount of money can purchase. Outside the hotel entrance, my driver pulled the sedan toward the curb. Charles opened the door for me before pausing one final time. Do not let tonight harden you completely, Helen, he said quietly. People like your sister spend their lives chasing appearances because they never learned how to value themselves honestly. I nodded once. I know. And I did know. That was the saddest part. Vanessa had spent decades building a beautiful life that still could not protect her from insecurity. Expensive jewelry. Country clubs. Luxury vacations. Perfect dinner parties. none of it had been enough to make her feel bigger than the frightened girl who once worried classmates would discover her sister cleaned motel rooms after school. I slid into the back seat of the car and watched the hotel entrance through the rain-speckled window as we pulled away slowly from the curb. Just before we turned onto Michigan Avenue, I caught one last glimpse of Vanessa standing alone beneath the lobby chandelier. Her arms folded tightly across herself. Her expression unreadable from this distance. For the first time in years, I did not feel the need to fix things between us. That surprised me more than anything. I spent most of my life trying to make other people comfortable with my existence. Trying to soften my success so nobody would feel threatened. Trying to shrink parts of myself so others could feel taller standing beside me. But somewhere between the candlelight, the silence, and the truth finally spoken aloud, something inside me had gone still. Peacefully still. The city lights blurred softly outside the window as we drove through the rain, and I rested my head gently against the seat. My hands no longer trembled. My chest no longer felt tight. Because dignity is a strange thing. Some people spend fortunes trying to buy it. Others build it. Slowly with exhausted hands, long nights, and years of invisible work. And sometimes the people who mocked your uniform never realize until far too late that you were the one holding the entire building together all along.